So hopefully my microphone doesn't give up today and we'll be all good. I'm Luke. I'm a developer from the UK and I work mainly with Laravel. I've been working with PEST for, about a year now, certainly with the expectation API. And the reason I'm talking about the expectation API is because I really do think it's the crux of PEST. It's the thing that drew me to it. And it's just so nice to use. Like when you're used to using this assert equals or whatever, and you first use the expectation API, it's like a dream come true. So I want to share my love for the expectation API with you today, hopefully show you some new things you've not seen before. And that might just light a little spark that makes you go and check PEST out, makes you go and try the expectation API, and I promise you won't regret it. But I'm actually going to start by talking about collections, not about expectations. And if you don't know, collections are a class in Laravel that wrap arrays. And they let us do all sorts of like common functions that we would usually do with for loops and for each loops. So transforming arrays, mapping arrays, pulling, pushing, etc. And Adam Wathan, he wrote an amazing book called Refactoring to Collections, which really kind of opened my eyes to the world of collections. And there were 3 points that kind of stood out from his book. The first is that collections are visually consistent. So when you look through the code, you've not got to try and work out what that for loop is doing or why that temporary variable is there. It's all just methods. It looks right. It's so much easier to read, so much nicer to scroll through a class that uses collections instead of arrays. It's also open for extension, and by that I mean that each collection method usually returns a new collection instance, which allows you to build these chains of collections, and it allows you to perform small transformations on the original array until you get the result you're after. And finally, it's self-documenting. And what I mean by that is once you've taken the time to learn the collection API, when you come back to it 6 months down the line or a year down the line, or you switch to a different project that's using Laravel, you understand what's going on. You don't have to relearn anything. And Adam kind of made this quote in his book. There's something beautiful about taking some data, piping it through a series of discrete transformations, and having the solution come out on the other side. Now, why am I talking about collections in a talk about expectations? Well, because I believe that if we change just a couple of words in this sentence, all of a sudden we are referring to the expectation API. And that is to say that there's something beautiful about taking a value, piping it through a series of discrete expectations, and having the result come out on the other side. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll agree with me that the beauty of collections is similar to the beauty of expectations. Now, when I asked you guys on Twitter what you wanted to hear, many of you said you wanted to listen to the expectation API talk, but there are a lot of you, in fact, the majority, who want to see a PHP unit test case migrated to PEST. So I promise I've not ignored this tweet. I am, in fact, going to show you exactly how to do that today. And we're going to have a bit of a 50-50 split. So hopefully you enjoy the content. You're probably expecting some code, and you're in luck. The code starts now. All right. So in PHP Storm, I've gone ahead, created a bit of a dummy Laravel application, and it's quite basic. It has one action. And this action is a handle method that receives an array of data. Now, this array of data is validated using Laravel's validation methods. We then save the user to the database. We create an organization for the user, and you can see here that that user's organization name is just their full name with the word organization appended on the end. And then we're imagining that this application is like an online bookstore, right? So users sign in, they buy books, and they read them. But when they first register, we don't want them to have to wait or buy anything. We want to get them started straight away. So we're going to give them 3 books for free. They're always the same 3 books. The first is Wind in the Willows, the second Oliver Twist, and the third Lord of the Rings, 3 classics. So they'll be good to go there. Now, I've already gone ahead and written a PHP unit test case for this action. So let's just have a quick look through it. You can see we're using the refresh database trait that comes with Laravel so that we can perform database tests. And we set up some valid data that we can reuse throughout this test. In our first test, we're just checking that a user can actually be created, that we can give it a first name, that the last name is as expected, the email works properly. And then we use Laravel's authentication system to make sure that that user has actually been saved and can be authenticated with. Our second test makes use of data providers in PHP unit. And we basically just check that if we pass in valid data, a validation exception gets thrown. In our third test, we're going to assert that the user receives their own organization. You'll notice that the organizations are a one-to-many relationship. So a user could belong to more than one organization. And we're just checking that the name is also accurate. The final test, perhaps the most complex one, we're checking that the books have been set up correctly. So first we check that they have 3 books. Then we loop through each of the books and check that each book is a book. And then finally, we go through each of the books individually and we check that the name, author, and number of pages in that book match our expectations. So let's start by converting these assertions to expectations. Start with this one here. And any expectation starts with the expectation global function. And what you pass to expect is the object you're interested in. This is perhaps the first thing that makes expectations better than assertions. The object that we're interested in testing is front and center rather than being tucked away at the end of the method. So how do we actually check the instance using expectations? Well, there's a handy method called toBeInstanceOf. We just pass the user class constant. And if I remove this and run this test, you'll see that it passes. Before we go any further, I just want to say we're still in PHP unit here, right? So you do not need to convert to PEST just to use the expectation API. You can start using the expectation API in your existing test cases today, and then you can slowly migrate to PEST when you feel ready to do so. Okay, let's carry on. Let's make the rest of these match the expectation API. So we're going to expect that the user's first name is Sam. The user's last name is Rowden. And the user's email is sam@downing.tech. Sam's a contributor to PEST, by the way, and is a good friend of mine. So that's why we're using him today. And finally, we have this assertion here, right? And we can use another expect with the logic inside of it to actually authenticate the user. We can just say to be true, chain that on the end. If you're wondering how you figure out which of these to use, well, head over to the PEST documentation. In expectations, available expectations, you can see everything available to you in the expectation API, such as my favorite, to match array, where you can check the value of an array or even an array subset when you're working, for instance, with API responses. It's so useful. Back to our test. This is cool, right? This is much nicer. All of our values are written at the start. The expectation API reads much nicer, in my opinion. But you'll notice that there's still quite a bit of boilerplate. We're having to repeat this call to expect 5 times. But in 4 of our 5 tests, we're making assertions on the same object, the user object. Well, in these cases, PEST actually turns it up to 11 by allowing us to make use of something called higher order expectations. Let me show how it works. I'm going to drop this onto another line just so we can be visually consistent. And then I'm going to come in and remove the expecting user calls, almost as if we're accessing the property on the user itself. I'll remove these wrappers too, and then I'll remove the semicolons till we get valid PHP syntax again. And I'm going to run this test. And you can see the test passes. Just so you know there's no trickery going on, I'll remove the W in Rowden. You'll see the test fails, and we even get the correct error message. This is higher order expectations, and it is mind-blowing. It's so fun to use. Anytime you're working with an object that has properties or methods, or an array, you can use higher order expectations to reach into the value and then perform assertions on whatever you've reached for. So in this case, we grab the first name, we check it's Sam. How clean is that? Seeing as we've got rid of every instance of user apart from this one here, we can now inline this. And I'm going to make use of a little PEST function called AND, which I can chain onto the expectation call in order to remove this as well and allow us to convert this entire test to one beautiful expectation chain. If you're wondering what and does, it basically just news up a new expectation. Run this again, our test passes. How sweet is that? And remember, we're still in PHP unit. We've not converted to PEST yet to make use of this. Okay, our second test doesn't really have any expectations in it, apart from this exception one, which we'll come back to later. So we're going to skip that for now. And we're going to play with this one. We're dealing with a collection here, as we mentioned earlier. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with my expectation. And let's grab the user's organizations. And remember, in this first instance, we're checking that the count is 1. So to have count 1. Now, if we're using higher order expectations from the get-go, we need to reach in and grab the first organization in the collection. So we can do that just as you would do if you were directly working with a collection using the first method. So higher order expectations aren't limited to properties. You can use methods as well. All right, so we'll grab the first, and we're going to say that that should be an instance of the organization class. That handles this line, so let's remove that. And then we want to check that the first organization's name equals Sam Rowden's organization. So we can grab the first expectation again, grab the name property from the first expectation. So you can reach in as deep as you want, and then we'll expect that to be Sam Rowden's organization. And let's delete this, run the test. You can see it passes. How awesome is that? You might be wondering, why do you need to call first twice? And to put it simply, anytime we perform an expectation method or a chain of expectation methods, such as if we chain to be on here, for example, scope of the higher order expectation is going to be reset. So that's why we have to call first again. And that just means you can get out of all sorts of sticky situations without having to go back up the chain or anything silly like that. But we're only using this user variable once again, so why don't we remove this and inline it, and then get rid of this line and this line. Everything still passes, so we're good there. And let's move on to our final test, perhaps the most complex. We're going to try writing it using higher order expectations again, seeing as we're in love with those now. So let's grab user books, and first of all, we do that same basic check. It should have 3 books. That gets rid of this. Now note that we have a for each loop. If you were working with PHP unit and you were using assertions, you would have to break into a for each loop to do this kind of test. But with the expectation API, we can stay right in the flow by using the each method. Each method is going to take an iterable value that you've passed to expect, and any assertions that you add on top of this will be passed to each item in the iterable. So let me show you what I mean. We can say to be instance of, note by the way that I still get all my PHP Storm syntax highlighting. I still get code completion. So don't worry about that. PEST has amazing support for all of this. So I check that each one is an instance of a book class. And let's remove this, run the test. We still pass. How cool is that? No need to break it into a for loop. I hope you can see what I'm talking about when I compare collections to expectations. All right, what about this? This is more complicated because it kind of is a loop, but each item has different values. Well, PEST doesn't leave us there either. We can do the same thing with the sequence method. If we look at the documentation for the sequence method, you'll see that it receives a variadic number of callbacks. So let's add a callback, a function that receives the book. And we're just going to say that the book's name should be, and we'll grab this Wind in the Willows title here. Now, to explain how sequence works, I'm going to run the test and show that it fails. And you'll see that the failure message is that it expected Wind in the Willows, but it received Oliver Twist. I can fix that message by adding another sequence item and changing the value here to Oliver Twist. When I run this again, I'm going to get a different error message. This time, it expected Wind in the Willows, but the actual one was Lord of the Rings. What's going on here? Well, the sequence is going to look at the index of the item you've passed in, and it's going to try to match it with the index of the iterable in the expect value. And then it will try to perform assertions on that iterable item. But if it runs out of callables before it runs out of items, it's going to loop back and start from the beginning. So we can fix this by simply adding another callable. and dropping Lord of the Rings in there. And when we run the test, it's with flying colors. So let's go select all of these instances, and we'll use higher order expectations again to select the author. And we need to make sure that the author is a certain value, which we'll fill in a moment. And then we need to grab the number of pages. And in this case, I'm going to use 2=, which is basically a type ignoring version of 2b. And that's because Laravel will probably coerce this integer into a string in the database. And then let's just go fill these values out, right? So Charles Dickens is going to go here. Kenneth Graham is going to be dropped in here. Tolkien is going here. Let's remove all of this code with all of its boilerplate, run this test, and boom, we pass. You might be thinking, well, why don't you just chain sequence onto the end of that each? And that would be cool, wouldn't it? But when I run this test, you'll see it fails. Without diving too deep into how PEST works here, when you are inside an each, you're basically stuck there for the remainder of the expectation. So my advice is always end on an each. Don't start with it. We can easily resolve this by dropping the sequence before the each. And when we run this, the test now passes. And seeing as we're only using user here again, we can take this, we can drop it in here and remove the temporary variable, run the test, and it's passed. How cool is that? All of our tests now make use of the expectation API. For some reason, PHP Storm has decided to drop my setup method all the way down there. So let me come back and drop it here. So whilst we have converted to expectations and everything looks so good, it can get even better by converting fully to PEST. So if you've come to see how to convert PHP unit to PEST, this is the moment you can start listening. The easiest way to convert to PEST is just to remove everything to do with classes. So that's how we're going to start. Now I want you to take note that we use refresh database here. And if you use traits in your classes or you have some form of special test case, then you can set that up in the pest.php file. In this case, we're saying that whenever there is a class in the feature directory, it should use this particular test case, and we want the refresh database trait. Couldn't be simpler. Right. We've removed that. We can remove the namespace because we're not working with classes anymore. Let's remove that as well. And there's a function that PEST provides called before each. So we'll have a callable in there, and we'll grab this data, drop it into there, move that semicolon to the outside. And before each is basically the equivalent of setup in PHP unit. So anything you do in setup, usually, you're just doing before each instead. All right, here's a tip to convert all of your tests to PEST quickly. I'm going to highlight public function test and globally select everything. And then I'm going to replace all of those instances with one of PEST's test functions. In this case, it, because I like the it syntax more than test syntax. I'll open that function up and I'll start with a string. I'll then use my ID to jump to the end of the line and close the string. And as a second parameter, I'm going to pass a function. Now we already have braces thanks to our PHP unit tests. So I'm going to select all of the end braces and close the it function followed by a semicolon. The only break in syntax comes around this data provider here. So let's fix this test up now. First of all, PEST doesn't need dot blocks. So let's remove this data provider dot block. And while we're here, let's clean this test name up. PEST test names can be anything you can think of because it's just a string. So it must have valid data, for example. In the function, we're going to pass our invalid data property just as we would in PHP unit with data providers. And how do we use this function here? Well, we can use a method called with in PEST. And what do we give to with? Well, we just provide the exact same data we were going to provide in our data provider method. Right, I'm going to refactor my code using the IDE at this point, and you'll see everything kind of jumps into place nicely. If you're wondering, well, what do I do if I want to use my data providers with multiple tests? Don't worry. If you go to the PEST documentation, down to data sets, there's shared data sets, and you can use your data across as many tests and test cases as you'd like. So that's already handled for you. All right, now that we're in proper PEST syntax, let's use the console PEST runner to make sure everything passes. It doesn't, so let's come back. I've left a brace in there, run it again. All of our tests are passing. That's great. So already we have converted to PEST. But if we add a little bit of extra sugar on top, everything becomes even sweeter. So let's do that. Let's rename our first test from it can create a user with underscores to it can create a user in beautiful English. And we're going to remove the second parameter, function, and just replace it by closing the it function. And you might think, what on earth are you doing? You've broken your test, and indeed I have, but not for long. We're going to make expect a chained method call onto it, and we're going to remove this unnecessary syntax at the bottom. What we have just created is a higher order test, not a higher order expectation, but a higher order test. This allows us to create these gorgeous chains of code where our test just becomes this fluent syntax. It's so nice to work with. Now, when we actually run this, the test will fail. And the error will be using this when not in object context. So what's going on here? Well, again, this isn't a deep dive into PEST itself. But basically, PEST has two stages. The first you can think of as a compile time or a build time. And that's where PEST takes all of this code and runs it ready to pass to PHP unit. In the second stage, it's going to build a test case and run it through PHP unit, which is when your actual test gets run. So during that first stage, we don't have access to the test case, which is what this piece of code here is doing. To get around this, we can pass a callable to a higher order test expect method. Notice here we're using Laravel's facades, which require the test case to have been set up to. So I'll do the same thing here. I'll pass a callable. And if I run this test again, it passes. How neat is that? All right, next test. We already did a lot of work here to convert this to PEST, but we can make it just a little bit better. I never liked in PHP unit how I had to put the expect exception at the top of my test. All of my other assertions take place at the bottom of the test. So why should I look at the top for an exception? With PEST, this is handled for you. You can simply chain on the throws method and pass in a validation exception class, which is what we're testing for. That allows us to remove this line completely. And if we run this test, it passes. All 6 tests in the data set are passing. Seeing as this is a one-liner, it would be cool to convert it to PHP 7.4's arrow syntax. So do that now. And that will allow us just to clean up these method calls a bit and refactor using our IDE. Okay, what else have I done wrong? Looks like I've got just maybe a missing bracket going on. Happy days. All right, so we're fully passed and all 6 tests pass. How much nicer is that? Again, these beautiful chains. This is what PEST allows you to do. So nice to work with. This test here is very similar to the first one when it comes to converting it to a higher order test. So we can just say it creates an organization for the user. Remember how I said to do it? We take the second parameter, we just remove it completely, make expect chainable, turn the value of expect to a callable so that it can access the test case, remove this syntax at the bottom, reformat, and pass. And the same with our last test, I guess. So it gives the user 3 books. Same process, we remove the function, make expect a chained method, make sure that this is a callable so that PEST can access the test case, remove the syntax at the bottom, reformat, and run. And all of our tests are passing. Let's go back to our console, run it again, and you can see all the tests pass with flying colors. And just look at those names as well. Those test names are so much nicer than what you get in PHP unit. I'm just going to zoom out for a second so you can see what we've created. Just look how nice this syntax is. Like, everything sings. It's not just code. It's readable. It's almost like reading a book. Let me compare it with the original. Zoom out again. All of this rubbish here is gone. We don't need to do any setup method. We don't make calls to the parent. We don't have to have namespaces and worry about that and our composer deposer JSON. We don't have to use underscores or camel case for our test names. We don't have to have all this boilerplate around assertions because expectations do all of that for us. We don't have to have doc blocks that get in the way. We don't have to have separate functions if we're only using our data providers for a single test. And then look at this last test. Like, compare this last test and tell me that that is not one of the nicest things you've ever seen. All the code goes away. The only thing left is the actual test itself. So nice. So that's the expectation API. That is everything you need to know to get started using expectations in your code today, whether you're going to use PEST in full or whether you want to stick to PHP unit just a little bit longer. And I'll just end by saying that if you enjoyed what you heard today, you want to see more PEST in projects, come join me for PEST in Practice. We stream every Wednesday, apart from this Wednesday, because it's the PEST Meetup. And yeah, we're going to do some really cool stuff on there. We're currently converting opendoor.me, which is a live site, to PEST. And we're doing that with Tom, the creator of opendoor.me. You'll probably know him. He's big in the Laravel community. And you can reach me on Twitter if you want to be reminded about all of that at LukeDowning19. Check out my blog, which I update very rarely, so sorry about that, at downing.tech. And I just want to say thank you. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks for spending your evening listening to what I have to say. And thanks, Nuno, for inviting me on the stream.